February 4th, 1987, Carlos Lehder stepped off a plane in Jacksonville, Florida, handcuffed, orange jumpsuit, DEA agents on both sides. He was facing life in prison plus 55 years. The charges: conspiracy to import 3.3 tons of cocaine into the United States. If convicted, Carlos would die in prison, but Carlos had information about Pablo Escobar, information about the Medellín Cartel, information that could destroy the most powerful drug empire in history. And the U.S. government wanted that information badly, so they made Carlos an offer. Testify against Pablo Escobar. Give us everything, and we'll reduce your sentence. Carlos looked at the prosecutor and said 2 words: I'll talk. What happened next changed the cocaine trade forever and made Pablo Escobar so furious that he sent hitmen to hunt Carlos Lehder from inside a Colombian prison. This is the story of the betrayal that shocked the world. To understand why Carlos Lehder betrayed Pablo Escobar, you need to understand what Carlos was facing in 1987. 6 a.m., Colombian police raided a safe house in Armenia, Colombia. Inside, they found Carlos Lehder. He wasn't armed, he didn't fight. He just stood there with his hands up and said, "I knew you were coming." Carlos had been running for years, hiding in the Colombian jungle, moving from safe house to safe house. But the Colombian government, under pressure from the United States, had finally tracked him down. Within hours, Carlos was on a plane to the United States. The DEA was waiting. February 4th, 1987, Jacksonville, Florida. Carlos Lehder was arraigned in federal court. The charges were staggering: conspiracy to import 3.3 tons of cocaine, conspiracy to distribute cocaine, racketeering, continuing criminal enterprise. If convicted on all charges, Carlos was looking at life in prison without parole, plus 55 additional years. Translation: Carlos would die in prison, no question. The prosecutor, Robert Merkel, stood in front of the judge and said, "Your Honor, Carlos Lehder is one of the most dangerous criminals in modern history. He has built an empire on death and addiction. He has corrupted governments. He has destroyed lives. We are asking for the maximum sentence." Carlos sat at the defense table, silent. His lawyer argued for bail. The judge denied it. Carlos was sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Miami to await trial, and that's when the government made their approach. March 15th, 1987, 2:30 p.m., 2 FBI agents walked into Carlos's cell. One of them was Special Agent Stephen Murphy. The other was Assistant U.S. You know it, we know it. The only question is whether you die at 80 or at 120. Carlos didn't say anything, but Merkel continued, "We can change that, if you cooperate." Carlos looked up. Cooperate how? Pablo Escobar. The room went silent. Carlos Lehder and Pablo Escobar had been partners for over a decade. Carlos ran the transportation. Pablo ran the production and distribution. Together, they moved billions of dollars worth of cocaine into the United States. But their relationship was complicated. Pablo saw Carlos as useful, but unstable, too flashy, too ideological, too unpredictable. Carlos saw Pablo as ruthless but necessary, the man with the product, the man with the power. They weren't friends, they were business partners, and in the drug trade, business partnerships don't include loyalty. Merkel leaned forward. "We want everything: routes, suppliers, bank accounts, properties, money laundering operations. And most importantly, we want testimony, in court, under oath, against Pablo Escobar." Carlos stared at Merkel. "And if I do this, your sentence gets reduced, significantly. Instead of life plus 55, you're looking at maybe 30 years, maybe less with good behavior." Carlos did the math in his head. Life plus 55 years, death in prison, 30 years. He'd be in his 60s when he got out. A chance at life. But there was a problem. If Carlos testified against Pablo Escobar, Pablo would kill him, not immediately, but eventually. Pablo had connections everywhere, in prisons, in governments, in law enforcement. If Pablo wanted Carlos dead, Carlos would die, unless Carlos could stay protected. Witness protection, Carlos asked. Full witness protection, Merkel confirmed. New identity, relocation, U.S. Marshals guarding you 24/7. Carlos leaned back in his chair. He thought about Norman's Cay, his island, his empire, all of it gone. He thought about his 33 years in the future, freedom or death in a cell. He thought about Pablo Escobar, the man who built an empire on fear and violence. And then Carlos made his decision. "I'll do it, but I want the deal in writing, and I want protection starting now." Merkel smiled. "Done." Carlos Lehder had just agreed to become the most famous informant in the history of the war on drugs. If you're already hooked by this story, hit that subscribe button right now, because what Carlos says on that witness stand will blow your mind. The deal was made. Carlos would testify against Pablo Escobar, against the Medellín Cartel, against everyone. In exchange, his sentence would be reduced from life plus 55 years to 33 years, and he would be placed in the witness protection program immediately. But first, Carlos had to prepare. The government gave him 3 years to get ready, 3 years to remember every detail of his life in the Medellín Cartel, every shipment, every meeting, every payment, 3 years to become the perfect witness. And in 1991, Carlos Lehder walked into a Miami courtroom and changed everything. November 18, 1991, United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, DEA agents, federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, everyone wanted to see Carlos Lehder testify against Pablo Escobar. Carlos walked in wearing a dark suit, clean-shaven, hair combed back. He didn't look like a drug lord anymore. He looked like a businessman. Carlos sat down in the witness stand, raised his right hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." And then Carlos Lehder started talking. For 3 days, Carlos told the world everything. He described how the Medellín Cartel was formed in 1976, how Pablo Escobar, the Ochoa brothers, José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, and Carlos himself sat in a room in Medellín and decided to control the cocaine trade. He explained how Norman's Cay became the main smuggling route, how planes would land on his private island, load up with cocaine, fly to Florida, drop the cocaine, return. He testified that between 1978 and 1982, over 300 tons of cocaine passed through Norman's Cay, 300 tons, with a street value of over $10 billion. The courtroom was silent. Then the prosecutor asked the question everyone was waiting for. "Mr. Lehder, did you work directly with Pablo Escobar?" "Yes." "And what was your relationship with Mr. Escobar?" Carlos paused, looked directly at the camera in the courtroom. "Pablo Escobar was my partner. We built the Medellín Cartel together. He controlled production. I controlled transportation. Without me, Pablo's cocaine never reaches the United States. Without Pablo, I have nothing to transport." "And how much money did you make together?" Carlos smiled. "Billions. We were making $300 million a month at our peak. 300 million, every single month." The prosecutor nodded. "Every single month." The prosecutor nodded. "And did Pablo Escobar ever order murders?" "Yes, hundreds." "Can you give an example?" Carlos leaned forward. In 1984, Pablo ordered the assassination of Colombian Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. Lara was investigating the cartel. Pablo saw him as a threat, so Pablo sent sicarios, hitmen, to kill him. They shot him on a highway in Bogotá, in broad daylight. "And you witnessed this." "I was in the room when Pablo gave the order." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to write. DEA agents leaned forward. The judge banged his gavel. "Order, order in the court." Carlos continued. He testified about bribes paid to Colombian officials, to police, to judges, to politicians. He named names, gave dates, provided documents. He described how Pablo Escobar built his own prison, La Catedral, because he didn't trust the Colombian government not to extradite him. He explained how Pablo lived in luxury inside his prison, prostitutes, drugs, parties, all while supposedly serving a sentence. And then Carlos dropped the biggest bombshell. Pablo Escobar has a network of informants inside U.S. law enforcement. He knows who's investigating him. He knows when raids are coming. He knows everything. The DEA agents in the room looked at each other. If Carlos was right, there was a mole, maybe more than one. The testimony went on for 3 days, and by the end, Carlos Lehder had given the U.S. government everything they needed to dismantle the Medellín Cartel. But Carlos had also made himself the most wanted man in Pablo Escobar's world. Subscribe right now, because what Pablo does next is absolutely insane. While Carlos was testifying in Miami, Pablo Escobar was watching from his prison in Colombia, La Catedral, the prison Pablo built for himself. Pablo had a TV. He watched the news coverage of Carlos's testimony, and Pablo was furious. According to witnesses who were in La Catedral at the time, Pablo stood up, threw a bottle of whiskey at the TV, and screamed, "That traitor! I'm going to kill him! I'm going to kill his entire family! I'm going to erase Carlos Lehder from history!" Pablo immediately called a meeting with his top sicarios. Popeye, La Kika, Blackie, all of them. Pablo gave the order, find Carlos Lehder. I don't care if he's in witness protection. I don't care if he's surrounded by US Marshals. Find him and kill him. The sicarios nodded. But there was a problem. Carlos was in the most secure witness protection program in the United States. He was being held in an undisclosed location, guarded 24/7 by armed US Marshals. His identity was classified. His location was classified. Even most FBI agents didn't know where Carlos was, but Pablo Escobar had resources. He had money. He had connections. He had informants. And Pablo was determined. Over the next 2 years, from 1991 to 1993, Pablo Escobar tried multiple times to find and kill Carlos Lehder. He sent sicarios to Miami, to Los Angeles, to New York. He bribed prison guards, DEA agents, anyone who might know where Carlos was. But the US Marshals were too good. Every time Pablo's men got close, Carlos was moved. New location, new guards, new identity. Carlos Lehder was a ghost, and Pablo Escobar was running out of time. December 2nd, 1993, 4:45 p.m. Medellín, Colombia. Pablo Escobar was hiding in a middle-class neighborhood. He'd escaped from La Catedral prison in July 1992, when the Colombian government tried to move him to a real prison. For 16 months, Pablo had been on the run, hunted by the Colombian police, by the DEA, by his enemies. But Pablo was still making calls, still giving orders, still running what was left of the Medellín Cartel. And one of those orders was kill Carlos Lehder. On December 2nd, Pablo was on the phone in a safe house. He was talking to one of his sicarios in the United States. Did you find him? No, patron. He's too protected. Every time we get a lead, he's gone. Pablo slammed his fist on the table. I don't care. Keep looking. I want Carlos Lehder dead. He's a traitor. He's a rat. He destroyed everything we built. But Pablo would never get his revenge. At 4:50 p.m., Colombian search block forces located Pablo's position using radio triangulation. They surrounded the house. Pablo tried to escape across the rooftops. He was shot and killed. Pablo Escobar, the most powerful drug lord in history, was dead at age 44. And Carlos Lehder, sitting in a witness protection facility somewhere in the United States, was finally safe. Pablo's death changed everything for Carlos. With Pablo gone, the Medellín Cartel collapsed. The Cali Cartel took over. Then the North Valley Cartel, then the Mexican cartels. But none of them cared about Carlos Lehder anymore. Carlos wasn't a threat. He wasn't competition. He was just a guy in prison. In 1995, Carlos's sentence was officially reduced to 33 years as part of his cooperation agreement. The US government kept their word, and in the late 1990s, Carlos was quietly transferred to Germany to serve the rest of his sentence there. Why Germany? Because Carlos Lehder had dual citizenship. His father was German, and the German government agreed to take him. This was kept secret for years. Most people thought Carlos was still in a US prison, but Carlos was in Germany, quiet, forgotten, safe. Meanwhile, back in Colombia, the legend of Carlos Lehder the informant spread. In the drug world, there's no worse label than rat, and Carlos Lehder was the biggest rat in history. He'd betrayed Pablo Escobar, testified against the Medellín Cartel, sent dozens of people to prison. For decades, Carlos's name was synonymous with betrayal. But here's the thing. Carlos Lehder survived. He testified in 1991. Pablo tried to kill him for 2 years, and then Pablo died. Carlos won. He outlived Pablo Escobar. He outlived the Medellín Cartel. He outlived the entire cocaine empire they built together. And in 2020, after 33 years in prison, Carlos walked free. Hit that like button if you're realizing that Carlos Lehder was playing a completely different game than everyone else. Let's talk about what Carlos's testimony actually accomplished. Because of Carlos Lehder's cooperation, the US government was able to indict and convict over 50 members of the Medellín Cartel, seize over $1 billion in assets, shut down major smuggling routes, expose corruption in Colombian law enforcement and politics. Carlos's testimony was the most damaging blow the Medellín Cartel ever took, more damaging than Pablo's death, because Carlos gave the DEA the blueprint. He showed them how the cartel worked, how they moved money, how they corrupted officials, how they smuggled cocaine, and that information helped dismantle not just the Medellín Cartel but every cartel that came after. Carlos Lehder, the man everyone called a rat, changed the war on drugs forever. But there's another side to this story. Carlos wasn't a hero. He wasn't testifying out of some moral awakening. He was testifying to save his own life. Carlos betrayed Pablo because it was the only way to avoid dying in prison. He cooperated because he had no other choice, and in doing so he became the most hated man in the drug trade. But Carlos didn't care, because Carlos understood something most people don't. Survival matters more than reputation. Pablo Escobar died protecting his reputation as a man who never cooperated. Carlos Lehder lived by destroying his reputation and cooperating. Who made the right choice? So let's ask the question, was Carlos Lehder a rat? Or was he a survivor? In the drug world, the answer is clear. Carlos is a rat, a traitor, the worst kind of criminal. But in the real world, the answer is more complicated. Carlos Lehder was facing life in prison plus 55 years. He was 37 years old. If he didn't cooperate, he would die in prison. So Carlos made a choice. He chose life over loyalty. He chose survival over reputation, and that choice saved him. Pablo Escobar made the opposite choice. Pablo never cooperated, never testified, never gave the government anything. Pablo died protecting his reputation as a man who never snitched. But Pablo also died at 44, shot on a rooftop, hunted like an animal. Carlos lived to 74, walked out of prison, disappeared into freedom. So who won? The man who died with his reputation intact, or the man who destroyed his reputation to stay alive? Here's what we know. Carlos Lehder testified in 1991. Pablo Escobar tried to kill him for 2 years. Pablo died in 1993. Carlos served 33 years and walked free in 2020. Carlos is still alive today. Pablo has been dead for 31 years. By any objective measure, Carlos won. He outlived his enemy. He outlived his empire. He outlived everyone who wanted him dead. And he did it by doing the one thing everyone said you should never do. He talked. Leave a comment telling me, was Carlos Lehder a rat or a survivor? Because I want to know what you think. There's one more thing we need to talk about. The cost. Because Carlos didn't just betray Pablo Escobar, he betrayed everyone. His partners, his friends, his associates. Dozens of people went to prison because of Carlos's testimony. Families were destroyed, lives were ruined, and Carlos knew that. But Carlos also knew that in the drug trade, loyalty is a myth. Everyone betrays everyone eventually. The only question is who betrays who first. Carlos betrayed first, and because of that he survived. Pablo stayed loyal, and because of that he died. In 2020, when Carlos walked out of that German prison, he walked out with one advantage. He was still breathing. Pablo Escobar has been dead since 1993. The Ochoa brothers spent decades in prison. Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha was killed in 1989. Every major member of the Medellín Cartel is either dead or still in prison, except Carlos Lehder, because Carlos made the deal. Subscribe one more time if this story taught you something about survival, loyalty, and the cost of staying alive in a world where everyone wants you dead. This is the story of Carlos Lehder and Pablo Escobar. Two men who built an empire together, two men who became enemies. One man died protecting his reputation, the other man destroyed his reputation to stay alive. And 30 years later, only one of them is still here to tell the story. Rest in peace, Pablo Escobar, 1949 to 1993. You died a legend. But you died. And Carlos Lehder, wherever you are, 74 years old, location unknown, you survived. You betrayed everyone. You destroyed your reputation. You became the most hated man in the drug trade, but you're still alive. And in the end, that's all that matters. This is the story of the betrayal that shocked the world, the testimony that destroyed the Medellín Cartel, and the man who chose survival over loyalty. Subscribe now for more untold stories about the people who changed history by making the hardest choices, because Carlos Lehder didn't just break the rules, he rewrote them. And 30 years later we're still debating whether he was a rat or a genius. The end.